Hello everyone, I'm your storyteller, and today I'm here to lead you into the shadows. I know you're using this video to help you sleep, so before we begin, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Lay back comfortably, relax, and let's begin. Part 1. The year was 1974. The Hill House stood isolated on the outskirts of a small New England town. The mansion was enormous, its Gothic spires piercing the sky like jagged claws. For decades, rumors had surrounded it. Whispers of disappearances, tragic deaths, and ghostly sightings. The house had been abandoned for nearly 20 years when the Harper family decided to move in. David Harper, a retired architect, had a passion for restoring historic homes. His wife, Evelyn, was less enthusiastic but agreed to the project for the sake of their children, 12-year-old Clara and 7-year-old Ben. David's dream was to turn Hill House into a bed and breakfast, but for the moment, it was just their new home, a fixer-upper with creaky floorboards and endless charm. The first few weeks passed without incident. David worked tirelessly, sanding floors and patching holes in the roof, while Evelyn busied herself with cleaning. The children explored every nook and cranny, laughing as they discovered secret passages and dusty old furniture. But Hill House didn't stay quiet for long. One chilly November evening, Clara was in her room, trying on a vintage dress she had found in the attic. She admired herself in the cracked mirror when she heard it, a faint whisper. "Clara." She froze. The sound was so soft she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all, but then it came again, more insistent. "Clara, come here." Her heart pounded. She opened her bedroom door and looked down the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. She slammed the door shut and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over her head. The next morning, she told her parents about the voice. David laughed it off. "Old houses make strange noises," he said. But Evelyn wasn't so sure. She had felt it too, an unsettling presence, as though they were never truly alone. Ben was the next to notice. One night, as he lay in bed clutching his stuffed rabbit, he saw a shadow move across his ceiling. At first, he thought it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The shadow moved deliberately, creeping from one corner of the room to the other. "Mommy?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The shadow stopped. It seemed to hover, watching him. Suddenly, the rabbit was yanked from his hands and thrown across the room. Ben screamed. David and Evelyn rushed in, finding their son sobbing. He pointed to the rabbit on the floor. "It took it," he cried, but there was no one there. A week later, Evelyn decided to tackle the basement, which had been locked since they moved in. With David at work and the kids at school, she found the key and ventured down alone. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, she found shelves lined with jars of cloudy liquid and an old wooden chair in the center of the room. As she inspected the chair, the basement door slammed shut behind her. The bulb overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows. Then she heard it, a low guttural growl. Evelyn screamed and bolted up the stairs, pounding on the door until it burst open. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for air. When David came home, she demanded they leave the house, but he refused. "We've put too much into this place," he said. "We're not leaving because of some bad vibes." The tension in the house grew unbearable. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the night. Evelyn began to research the house's history and discovered its dark past. In the 1800s, it had belonged to a man named Joseph Hill, who was rumored to be a cult leader. People claimed he had performed rituals in the basement, summoning things better left unnamed. One stormy night, everything came to a head. Clara woke to find her room freezing cold. Her breath formed white clouds as she sat up in bed. Standing at the foot of her bed was a figure, a woman in a tattered black dress, her face pale and her eyes hollow sockets. Clara screamed, waking the entire family. They ran to her room just as the window shattered, letting in a gust of icy wind. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered. David finally relented. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaking. They packed whatever they could carry and fled into the night, never looking back. Hill House remains empty to this day, its windows dark and uninviting. The Harpers never spoke publicly about what happened, but whispers in the town grew louder. Some say the house is alive, feeding on fear and sorrow. Others claim they've seen shadows in the windows, waiting for the next family to move in. And so, the house stands, a silent sentinel on the hill, holding its secrets close. For now. Part 2. The year was 2018, and the setting was a small suburban high school just outside of Boston. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon. The bell rang, marking the start of the last period. Students shuffled through the halls, their chatter echoing against the pale tiled walls. Among them was Emily, a junior who loved art and often stayed late to finish her sketches. She was reserved, preferring the quiet company of her notebook over the noisy cafeteria. Her best friend, Jacob Chu, was the complete opposite. Loud, funny, and always the center of attention. He convinced Emily to hang out in the library after school to help him with the history project. The school felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that made Emily pause as she pushed open the library doors. Inside, a few students sat hunched over books, and the librarian, Mrs. Thatcher, was busy shelving returns. Then it happened. A sharp, shrill alarm pierced the air. "This is not a drill," a voice announced over the PA system. "The school is now in lockdown. Teachers, secure your classrooms. Students, remain silent and follow instructions." Panic erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as students scrambled to hide. Emily's heart raced as she ducked under a study table, pulling Jacob down with her. Mrs. Thatcher hurried to lock the library doors, her face pale and her hands trembling. "What's going on?" Jacob whispered. Emily shook her head, her mouth dry. Through the library's glass walls, she could see the darkened hallways. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows, and every creak of the building felt deafening. Minutes passed, each one dragging longer than the last. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. "Someone's out there," Emily mouthed, her eyes wide. The footsteps stopped right outside the library. The handle of the locked door rattled violently. Emily held her breath as a shadow moved past the frosted glass. It paused, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself stopped. Jacob grabbed Emily's arm. His grip was tight, almost painful. "What do we do?" he whispered. Before she could answer, the shadow moved away, disappearing into the darkness. Mrs. Thatcher motioned for everyone to stay hidden. Her lips formed the words, "Stay calm," but her eyes betrayed her fear. Another 20 minutes passed. The lockdown dragged on, and the tension in the room was suffocating. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the school, a door being forced open. Emily's instincts kicked in. She gestured to Jacob and whispered, "We have to move. Now." "No way," Jacob hissed. "They told us to stay put." "We'll be sitting ducks if they come back," Emily insisted. Reluctantly, Jacob followed as she led him toward the emergency exit at the back of the library. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows. Mrs. Thatcher caught sight of them but didn't stop them. Maybe she understood their desperation. The emergency exit door creaked as Emily pushed it open. Cold air hit her face as they stepped outside, but their relief was short-lived. A figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was a man dressed in black from head to toe, his face obscured by a mask. He stood perfectly still like a predator watching its prey. Jacob froze, but Emily's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in again. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and held it up like a weapon. "Stay back," she yelled, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head as if amused. Then, without warning, he lunged. Emily swung the extinguisher with all her might, hitting him in the shoulder. He stumbled, giving her and Jacob just enough time to bolt. They ran down the alley behind the school, their breaths visible in the chilly evening air. They didn't stop until they reached the main road where flashing police lights greeted them. Officers swarmed the area, ushering students out of the building. But when Emily and Jacob tried to explain what had happened, their story was met with confusion. "No one was in the library hallway," an officer said. "We've checked the entire building. It's clear." "But we saw him," Emily protested. Jacob nodded. "He was real. He came after us." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll investigate further," he said. But his tone suggested otherwise. Emily and Jacob never got answers. The lockdown was later attributed to a false alarm, though no one could explain the crashes or the shadowy figure. For weeks, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, she would wake up, convinced she heard footsteps outside her window. Jacob tried to laugh it off, but he too seemed changed, quieter, more subdued. The school eventually returned to normal, but Emily and Jacob knew the truth. Someone or something had been there that day, and whatever it was still out there waiting. Part 3. The year was 1923, and the Willow Manor stood proudly in the heart of the English countryside. It was a sprawling estate surrounded by ancient willow trees whose branches seemed to reach out like ghostly fingers. Victoria Harper had never believed in love at first sight until she met Charles Whitmore. Their romance blossomed in the warm summer months, filled with long walks through the gardens and evenings spent in the grand library of Willow Manor. Charles, a brooding artist with piercing blue eyes, had come to the manor seeking inspiration. Victoria, the heir to the estate, found herself drawn to his mysterious charm. But there was something about the manor that unsettled Charles. At night, the walls seemed to whisper, and the air carried a chill that couldn't be explained. Victoria dismissed his concerns as mere imagination, the quirks of a creative mind. "You'll grow used to it," she said one evening, her laughter echoing softly in the dimly lit hall. Charles wasn't so sure. One stormy night, Charles was working in his studio, painting Victoria's portrait. The rain battered against the windows, and the candlelight flickered. As he added the final touches to her smile, a faint knock echoed through the room. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Charles set down his brush and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. He stepped back, his heart racing, and then he saw it. A shadow moving at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't human. The shadow twisted unnaturally, its form stretching and shrinking as it approached. Charles slammed the door shut and bolted it, his breath coming in short gasps. The next morning he told Victoria about the shadow. She listened intently, her brow furrowed. "There's something I need to tell you," she said hesitantly. Victoria revealed that Willow Manor had a dark history. Generations ago, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, a distant relative, had lived there. Consumed by jealousy and unrequited love, Eleanor was said to have cursed the estate. "No love shall prosper within these walls," she had vowed before taking her own life. Charles tried to brush off the story as an old family legend, but the days that followed were anything but ordinary. Victoria began to change. She grew pale and distant, her vibrant laughter replaced by long, empty stares. One evening, as they dined in the grand hall, she suddenly stood up, her eyes glazed. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. "The music," she said, tilting her head. "It's calling me." Charles heard nothing, but Victoria walked away as if in a trance. He followed her to the east wing, a part of the manor long abandoned. The air grew colder with each step. At the end of the corridor was a locked door. Victoria stopped in front of it, her hand hovering over the handle. "Victoria, don't," Charles pleaded. She turned to him, her face expressionless. "It's already too late." That night, Charles couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He lit a candle and decided to confront whatever was haunting them. The manor was eerily silent as he made his way to the east wing. The locked door was ajar, creaking softly in the draft. Inside, he found Victoria standing before a large mirror, her reflection flickering as though it didn't belong to her. "Victoria!" he called out. She turned to him, her eyes now a deep black. "She's here," she said in a voice that wasn't her own. In the mirror, a figure began to form. It was Eleanor, her pale face twisted in rage. "You dare defy me?" she hissed. The room grew colder, and the candle flickered out. Charles grabbed Victoria's hand and pulled her away from the mirror. Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing through the manor. The glass shattered, and the force knocked them both to the ground. The next morning, Charles was determined to break the curse. He spent hours in the library, combing through old journals and letters. He discovered that Eleanor's curse could only be broken by an act of true love, something pure and selfless. That evening, Charles led Victoria to the gardens, away from the oppressive walls of the manor. He knelt before her, tears in his eyes. "Victoria, I love you," he said, "and I'll do whatever it takes to save you." But Eleanor wasn't done. Her shadow emerged from the trees, swirling like a storm. "You cannot win," she snarled. Charles stepped forward, shielding Victoria. "Take me instead," he said. Eleanor hesitated, her form flickering. "You would sacrifice yourself for her." "Yes," Charles said firmly. The shadow shrieked and dissolved into the night. The air grew still and the oppressive weight lifted. The curse was broken, but Willow Manor was never the same. Charles and Victoria left, vowing never to return. The estate fell into ruin, its windows dark and its halls silent. But some say Eleanor's spirit still lingers, waiting for another chance to claim what she believes is hers. Let me know if this draft meets your expectations or if you'd like adjustments.